whether the future is going to be here. So this event is it's called Fletcher Reads the Newspaper. The origin of it was that we always talk about Fletcher as the ultimate place for interdisciplinary conversation, interdisciplinary learning. And we have often reflected on the fact that, each one of us on the faculty, I've got, several distinguished members of our faculty here. And they're distinguished because they are mentors, instructors, professors, scholars, but they are deep experts within their own disciplines. They are the intradisciplinary experts of Fletcher. The true interdisciplinary experts at Fletcher are actually our students, because they take a class with Professor Toft or Professor Truckman or Professor Jaffe, and they put those ideas together in their heads, and they can combine security studies with international law, with energy policy, and then they come up with a truly unusual perspective on the world, and they can interpret problems in an interdisciplinary way and come up with solutions. So we thought an interesting way to really formalize this interdisciplinary part of Fletcher is to organize around a topic that demands an interdisciplinary lens. And what better topic than to just look at the front pages of the newspapers and see what's hanging around on the front page above the fold for day after day after day. And every semester we find such a topic. And of course, this semester, it's inescapable, the topic being the ongoing crisis, war, invasion of Ukraine. And I'll note that the New York Times, I think it was only last Friday that they stopped publishing their front page without a headline running right across from left to right at the top, which suggests that if you use the editors of the New York Times as barometers of what's important in the world, that was a pretty significant barometer for 5 weeks and counting. Every single day, the headline was about, kind of running across the top. So today's topic builds off of the war in Ukraine. And we are posing the question of what are the implications for business as this war unfolds? What role does business and finance and economics play as a war in its traditional sense is raging in that part of the world, as bombs are falling on people, as their homes are being decimated, as more than 10 million have been driven out of their homes, and about half of that 10 million have been driven out of their country. And of course, scenes out of Ukraine are devastating, and there is so much more to talk about over there. But just in today's conversation, we'll focus on the business and economic impact. And
Terminal A. Thank you.
We just mute everybody who's on screen. Thank you. So the way we're going to do this discussion today is we are going to ask our intradisciplinary experts to give us a perspective on the state of the conflict as it stands today and where it might be going. And it'll help us situate the nature of the problem that we are confronting right now in Ukraine. And then we'll pause, we'll have a conversation across our colleagues here from the faculty. And then I'll actually turn this over to the room, to the interdisciplinary experts, which is all of you, our students and prospective students, and ask you to answer a problem, a question that is on the minds of a lot of senior decision makers, in particular, senior decision makers in business. And so I'll hold off on posing the problem to you right now, but let me just kick this off with our intradisciplinary part of this discussion. Okay, and just for background, those of you who are new to Fletcher, who are thinking about Fletcher possibly as their home, for not just for the next year or the next 2 years, but really their home for the rest of their lives, because you might come to Fletcher for a couple of years, but Fletcher is not going to be. You can reflect on this discussion as what you should expect, coming and becoming a part of this community. Having the courage to jump across boundaries, disciplinary boundaries, geographic boundaries and boundaries of all kinds, and really kind of work with the community to think about complicated problems in ways that you can make sense of, and then come up with solutions relating to the problem. So I'm not going to chew up any more time. Let me turn this over to my distinguished colleagues here, Professor Monica Toft, who is the director of the Center for Strategic Studies. She is a scholar in security studies, and I often turn to her to try and understand grand strategy, the strategy of great powers, and interpretation of geopolitical conflict. And of course, all of that is coming together in the crisis we're talking about. Next to Professor Toft is Professor Joel Trackman, who's the director for the Center for Law and Governance, and he is a scholar of international law, and with a particular focus on the interplay between international law and international business. And then we have Amy Morris-Jaffe, who is our professor of climate and energy policy, and the managing director of the Climate Policy Lab. And her expertise is in energy policy and the transition from traditional fossil fuels to renewable and green energy. As we know, energy is the biggest sector that has been affected by the sanctions on Russia, of course, along with several other sectors. We thought it would be particularly important to try and situate the business and economic impact, looking at it through the lens of energy and the impact on the energy transition. So if I could open by perhaps asking Professor Toft to help us just get a sense of where we are right now in this conflict, the underlying geopolitical factors, and what might we expect in the coming weeks and months?
Sure. Thanks, Bhaskar. Welcome, everybody. I'm Monica Toft. So I'm trained as an international relations scholar and political scientist. So I come from the social sciences perspective, and I tend to do analyses that combine both sort of data and statistical analysis, but also qualitative analysis. So I've done a lot of work, historically, and looking at sort of historical narratives. And as an IR scholar, when we look at problems like Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, I think we can say that here. We've talked about this thing, and those of you who are international relations students, we talk about levels of analysis. So we look at the individuals involved, we look at the domestic political systems involved, and then we look at the international or global system in which those actors and states are operating. And so when you ask how we got here, Bhaskar, we can look at Putin, the individual. And I think it's clear this is a man that's comfortable with violence, right? You look at his background, he was in the FSB, right? He went into Crimea, first he went into Georgia with the use of force, then he went into Crimea, didn't have to use as much, and then he went into Donbass. So this is a man that's quite comfortable with the use of force in order to get his way, coercion, right? He's taken out domestic opposition. Nemtsov, he tried to take off Boris Nemtsov, he actually was killed, I suspect, outside the Kremlin, and then what's his name? The poisoning of Navalny, Alexei Navalny, right? So this is a man who does not mind being a bully. And that's not, I don't want to say that all Russian leaders are that way. Yeltsin was hesitant. I mean, yes, there was the storming of the White House, and he was out there, but Gorbachev was clearly a Soviet leader, right, who was not comfortable with the use of force, and actually Putin called the breakup of the Soviet Union the worst catastrophe, and he actually believes that Gorbachev could have held it together, and I think he believes that Gorbachev could have held it together if Gorbachev had only been willing to use force, particularly against the Baltic states early on when the Soviet Union was collapsing. So that's one, is you really do want to look at the characters involved. So Putin, and then you want to look at his interlocutors. And Zelensky, President Volodymyr Zelensky, would like for his country to be part of the EU and to be part of NATO. And the West didn't do him any favors by having sort of strategic ambiguity toward him, saying potentially, yes, in the future you could do that. And so with Zelensky not sort of being a statesman that fully appreciated who he was dealing with on the other side in terms of Vladimir Putin, right? That this was a man who in all likelihood might use force against him, sort of pushed the envelope. And I'm not putting the burden and the onus on him, right? This is a strategic interaction, but you want to look at who's on the other side. Domestic politics matters a lot here in terms of the Russian state. Putin, since '99, since he came into power, he was selected by Yeltsin, and then he was elected by the population and kept power through alternating between prime minister and presidency. He's basically gone around and what he's done is consolidated power, first trying to, appointing regional governors rather than having elections, and really getting sort of control, much more control, financial and political control. So as a political scientist, we would say that that country is minimally anacratic, if not autocratic. And what we mean by that is that he runs the government or the state with an iron fist. And autocrats can sort of do what they want, and the population sort of has to go along with it. Now, there was some punctuated moments of democracy, of free press, but as we've seen particularly lately, there's no free press, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. That's all sort of gone by the wayside. And Putin was very clear that he was going to consolidate power, and he's been doing that. So that's at the domestic level. And then at the international level, the West didn't do itself any favors. I already talked about the strategic ambiguity about sort of pushing NATO east, and then the EU enlarging east as well, when it was very clear that this was seen as a threat. Gorbachev was very clear this is a threat. And you have to understand, this is a country that was invaded in 1812 by Napoleon. In my house, I have a picture, a poster with Tufte's graphics showing Napoleon's retreat, right? It was invaded by the United States during the Russian Revolution. 14,000 American troops went onto Russian territory. People don't realize that, right? And then, of course, the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the Germans during World War II, with Stalin pleading with the West, please help, these German machine is wreaking havoc. And they suffered huge losses. The Great Patriotic War is very, very big and resonant with the Russian population even today. And so when the West sort of prevailed with the end of the Cold War, George H.W. Bush's administration did a brilliant job, right? Understanding that there were humans and there was status and egos on the other side, and ushering in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we seem to have lost sight of that, right? I think George H.W. Bush and his team should go down as one of the best foreign policy teams the United States has ever had. And then it sort of went down from there in the sense that we got really hubristic, right? And we sort of didn't listen and hear what Putin and his supporters, he's got supporters, let's make no men's here, that he actually has supporters within that government who are helping him to facilitate this, which is why the sanctions regime. So it's a combination. And then, there's nationalism, right, going on here, where does Russia begin and end? Where does Ukraine begin and end? There is an amorphous history here with these two countries, these two peoples intermixed. And if you look at polling, the number one thing that's supported is open borders between the two countries, right? They would like to live in peace and harmony, but it's going to be quite difficult now. So there's a multi-level game going on here, both domestically within each country and then internationally. Now, the sanctions regime, should I just run through where we are right now? The sanctions regime that's been put on to Russia is the hardest hitting thing that we've ever seen historically, ever. It's a formidable state. It controls a lot of commodities. And I think Amy is probably going to talk about energy. And so it's not just the energy sector, but also grains and minerals, right? So the problem with sanctions is not only going to hurt Russia, but it's going to hurt other countries and other populations. Egypt's already announced that it's going to have a big crisis. Russia's the largest wheat exporter, 37.3 million tons, followed by the US and Canada at 26 million each. It's going to be a problem. By the way, Ukraine is right there, but Ukraine right now, because of the war, can't plant. So we're in trouble because spring wheat's not going to come. And so after the sanctions regime was put in 2014, we've now doubled them at the end of February. So we're now before February, we had 3,606. We had 2,754 sanctions. After, we now have 5,581, and that's against individuals, against different industries. And Iran comes in at second with 3,616 sanctions. Think about that, size of Iran relative to Russia. So now we've got 5,600 against Russia and 3,600 against Ukraine. And Ukraine is still a functioning state for the most part, right? So it's an issue when you're thinking about sanctions and whether they're efficacious. And if you look at who's supporting the sanctions regime, yes, we would love as the United States to say this is global. And it is global when you look at the globe, but when you look at where it's actually happening, it's basically our allies, right? So South Korea, Japan, the UK, Taiwan, New Zealand, Australia, the EU, and Canada. That's it, folks. And then if you even look at the sanctions within that, there is an agreement across them. So you can get a chart of who's sanctioning what in different industries, and there's not full agreement. And then critically, in this case, you want to know about global politics is that China is not on board. And what we do with Russia, of course, is signaling to China what we would do about Taiwan. And so we have to be very, very careful. And sanctions take a really long time to work. And so the question is Russia has been preparing for this since 2014. It built up its gold reserves, and it was well aware, and different banking systems and that kind of thing, well aware that this was coming. However, to give you an up part, Ukraine does seem to be dominating the information war, at least globally. Russia's doing it domestically. They've been able to sort of it's very impressive. Zelensky is a fabulous wartime leader, totally unexpected, totally unanticipated. And he's doing a brilliant job just showing the horrifying situation in his country. And Russia's inability to control the narrative about what's really happening in Ukraine is not good for Putin. Now he's trying, and in fact, my understanding, and there's maybe other people who are more expert or have better, information, and is that what really pissed Putin off was not that he was losing, that the Kharkiv operation didn't go down in 3 days. He sent these troops in with 3 days of food and 3 days of fuel, and guess what? They ran out of food and they ran out of fuel, and here we are, that they're retreating east. What he was upset about is the Americans had such good intelligence about the operation. Again, this is a man who likes control, FSB, right? That's what upset him. So darn right now he's going to really try to get control of that information space. But the longer this goes on, the harder that's going to be, because sons, daughters, husbands, uncles, brothers are not coming home. And we know the level of killing is really high, at least on the Russian side. We know it's high on the Ukrainian and civilian side. But for a modern army, these are really high casualties. We haven't seen this kind of thing. I would say probably when the numbers are all out, yes, it's what I do for a living, I'm sorry, but it's probably going to be as horrific as World War I. We've had at least 7 generals killed on the battlefield. So the critical question is whether Russians will rise up against Putin, and they've done that in the past. They have, let's not forget, there's been multiple Russian revolutions. And the problem is that, again, that's going to take time, and it's scary. You can face a 15-year sentence now if you rise up. And in line with that, the West has made it very clear that the cost of American or Western troops on the ground is not worth it. They're not going to do it. And a sanctions regime alone is not going to pull back territory, claw back territory. You usually need something. And on top of that, the most recent polls coming out of Russia, Levada is probably the best outfit. Putin's popularity ratings have been rising. He went from the low 70s in February to the low 80s now in late March. So this is not good news. It's not unexpected because we get the rally around the flag effect. So will the sanctions work? It's not clear. And here I'm going to paraphrase our colleague Dan Dresner, whose class I'm teaching right now. He's taught me a lot about sanctions. That we typically look for a number the question is are we going to bear more costs or less costs than the other side? And right now we're bearing less costs. Russia's bearing more, but that might change. And then when it involves conflict over territory, sanctions alone usually don't work. You usually have to send troops in or something else. And so economic coercion typically needs to be aligned with military coercion. Second, elites need to be hurt in addition to the population. And the question has Putin and his cronies and the elites, have they guarded themselves enough that they're not going to get hurt? We don't know. We have to see. And then finally, you can't have what Dan calls a black night. And we do have a black night in the form of China. China absorbs 1/3 of Russia's oil. Amy's probably going to talk about that. And so that's why it's really important to watch what China does, because China can help facilitate the amount of cost that Russia's going to have to absorb. So what I'd say is where we are right now is, I think we're not close to an end. I don't think we're close to we'll see what happens. I think we need to help Putin save face. I hate to say that because that man shouldn't have to be save face, But, we've got status and egos going on here, and I think we're at school, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. INCR is one of our strongest, conflict resolution. And the human dimension is really important. And President Biden, yes, I agree with him. Putin is a war criminal, and that he should be removed from office. But the minute he put Putin in that corner, that was literally a corner, Putin's going to have to fight his way out. This is what Assad did in Syria. And I think about it on the interpersonal level. Do you think Putin's going to be a happy man if he doesn't survive and Assad does? No. So Putin is now in the fight for his life.
So thank you, Professor Toft, for a brilliant laying of the table, and shall I say, a multidimensional chess table. And as we know, Russians have a longer history of playing chess than many other parts of the world. So the US and its allies had multiple options, putting men and munitions on the ground. No, not going to go there. Close the skies over Ukraine. So far, no. Providing supplies and ammunition, fighter jets and so on. Yes, maybe, and so on. But the one thing that they have definitively done, at least within a smaller circle of allies, is impose sanctions. And then your proposition is that the sanctions, the economic war, the business war, is not going to be enough to get this to a resolution, get this to an end game. Professor Trackman, help us think through the impact of sanctions. And so when you think about sanctions, there's sanctions imposed by governments, and then there are voluntary sanctions that companies, over 500 companies, have stepped away from Russia in some way, shape, or form. Do you share Professor Toft's pessimism about sanctions being an effective tool to get us to an end game?
Thank you, Bhaskar. Thank you to my colleagues, and welcome to the students. I want to start, I'll answer your question, not very well, but I'll answer it. But I want to start by separating the descriptive from the normative. And Professor Toft has provided an excellent descriptive analysis of how we got here. And I'm sure she didn't intend it, and I want to be clear to everyone else in the room that it's not a normative analysis. It doesn't say that because some of the actions by the United States and the Europeans may have given rise to Putin's decision, that decision is either ethically or certainly legally defensible. It's clearly not legally defensible, and I believe it's not ethically defensible either. So I want to start with the idea of geoeconomics and the fact that globalization has occurred. It's occurred and receded at different times. But as globalization occurs, it raises the costs to all of the participants of undermining globalization. And Putin's actions have undermined globalization, and the sanctions that responded have also undermined globalization. And that's part of this cost calculus that Professor Toft referred to. How do you view these costs? And often, maybe always, these sanctions have a reciprocal nature. They have an own foot shooting nature. When you shoot the other guy with sanctions, you're shooting yourself. And why? Because those transactions that you're blocking were voluntary, efficient transactions. And there was surplus on both sides. There was consumer surplus and producer surplus. And so people are losing from those sanctions. When the European community, the predecessor to the European Union, was formed in 1957, its theorists, its leaders, Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman, had the idea of making war between Germany and the other members of the European community impossible by making them globalized, making them Europeanized, integrating them. And it's interesting, I think, that Russia's globalization, such as it is, did not prevent Putin from going to war. And we can see these sanctions as a way of saying you can't have it both ways. And we are willing to make some sacrifices, as Professor Chakraborty has said. We are willing to make some sacrifices of our own welfare in order to undermine yours, in order hopefully to convince you, A, to desist, and B, not to go to the Baltics or Poland or whatever the next step is. And it's true that sanctions have been spotty and perhaps relatively ineffective in the past. These sanctions, except as Professor Toft has said quite correctly, are relatively comprehensive. We have the West getting together in a way that they haven't done before. And that's kind of an accomplishment of Putin and an accomplishment of the Biden administration, that it's brought the West together. But it is remarkable that the South has not joined it. That China, India, Mexico, South Africa, Brazil, any of the large countries, and indeed all of the smaller countries, are saying, well, we're sitting this one out. And so that raises the question of how effective these sanctions can be, and the question of what alternatives there are. So there are alternative markets, as we'll learn in a moment, for oil. Maybe not so much for natural gas, which requires pipelines and liquefaction and other facilities. And there are alternative markets for wheat, but there aren't necessarily alternative ways to get certain high-tech products. And this is a demonstration exercise for China in terms of high-tech imports and exports. So some have said this, combined with the pandemic, is the end of globalization. Actually, today, trade is above its pre-pandemic levels. So globalization has not ended. And globalization tends to be robust because there are economic factors that cause us to want cheaper goods, better goods, and so on. And of course, Russia is economically small. It's the size of Spain. It's 3% of world GDP. But then there are knock-on effects. And there's China waiting in the wings. China, of course, is quite large. So I think it is important to say, I wouldn't call it that business has necessarily engaged in sanctions, but it's made strategic withdrawals that look like sanctions. And I think it would be a great study to see which businesses have withdrawn and how did they do that calculus. What was their sunk investment in Russia? What were the threats of consumer reaction that they responded to? What were the threats of government action in their home states that they responded to? And how did they make that calculus? I think that would be an interesting study. But we know that there are different reactions. It's remarkable that a number of businesses have left. But remember, Russia is 3% of world GDP. McDonald's can leave Russia. And yes, it's going to lose something, but it's not going to lose as much as if all of the Europeans and Americans start to boycott McDonald's. So it is remarkable how many companies have left, and a number of companies have reported losses. A number of companies have decided to stay, like Koch Industries and Korn Ferry. And so we might look at what caused those different reactions. So the main areas of sanctions are financial, including freezes of central bank assets, including exclusion from the SWIFT system. And this goes to, I'll just refer to our colleague Dan Dresner again. He's got a project on geoeconomics with Newman and Farrell that looks at power in particular nodes. And the SWIFT system is an example of that. It's also a question of governance, because the SWIFT system, a system for engaging in communications about correspondent bank relationships, that is actually critical to all sorts of trade and financing transactions. That SWIFT system is governed by the G7. And they can say, Russia, you're out. They have that power and they control that node. And Russia has been furiously trying to build a different system because they recognize that that power of the G7 is a threat to them, has been a threat. So there are freezes of central bank assets, which makes it hard for Russia to support the ruble because they don't have those external assets they can use to buy rubles to support the ruble. And so there's inflation in Russia, which has domestic political effects. There have been import controls. Interestingly, Canada and Australia have done, and the rest of the G7 countries have said they're going to do, including the United States, a denial of most favored nation tariff treatment to Russian goods. So that'll really limit Russian exports. There are direct export controls on things like steel and aluminum. The United States has restricted imports of Russian oil and coal. And Europe has not done that yet, but I think Macron today came out and said we should do that, and there may be more movement in that direction. So there are import controls, there are export controls on high-tech goods, led by the United States on semiconductors, computers, telecoms, equipment, things of that nature. The United States, interestingly, has long experience with these export controls and applies them in a way that is often viewed as extraterritorial. One dimension of that is if a product manufactured, say, in Brazil, has 25% United States controlled content or intellectual property, the United States purports to control that too and will punish the Brazilian purchaser or licensee if they transfer that to a restricted state like Russia. So there are important extraterritorial aspects to this. The United States, with respect to Iran, engaged in secondary sanctions, saying, if you deal with my enemy, I will deal with you. It hasn't yet done that with Russia, but it may be a next step. And if a Chinese company or a Brazilian company had to choose, do I deal with the United States or do I deal with little tiny Russia? I think they're going to have a tough choice along those lines. So there are export controls. The EU has followed suit on a number of these export controls. China and India, of course, have not. Other BRICS countries have not. So we'll see how that affects Russia. But Russia needs intermediate goods, it needs equipment, it needs intellectual property for its advanced manufacturing, for its weapon systems. And if it can't get those things, its economy will grind to a halt. And we've already seen that its transport sector, because of restrictions, export controls on servicing airplanes and allowing those airplanes to actually move to Russia and fuel outside of Russia and get spare parts and so on, is going to destroy air transport in that very territorially large country, economically small, but territorially large. So we've got a lot of interesting issues. So let me just list a few of the legal issues, and if there are questions, I can try to answer them. One is this one of legal methods of control. There's territorial sovereignty. I can block exports from my country. I can try to reach out extraterritorially and block exports from your country. There are these questions of governance. So interestingly, some states have said we want to bounce Russia out of the World Trade Organization. There's just no mechanism for doing that unless you make an amendment of the World Trade Organization agreement. And by the way, all of those developed countries, there are a lot of them. Each of them has a vote in this stuff. And so it will be very hard to take Russia out of the World Trade Organization. But what is possible, and this is a really interesting area, is that the World Trade Organization agreement and investment agreements, not all, but many of them have security exceptions. And those security exceptions refer to actions taken in time of an emergency in international relations. That's what we're going through now. And so every WTO member state has the authority under the WTO agreement to stop providing access to Russian exports. And I was thinking about the Nord Stream 2 plant and the possibility of investor-state dispute settlement under the Energy Charter Treaty against Germany for its decision to stop Nord Stream 2. And there is a similar security exception in that Energy Charter Treaty. So that will be a question about the availability of those security exceptions to avoid a very, very large cost. There are interesting questions about due process for individuals, for the oligarchs and the Siloviki, for Putin himself. There are interesting questions about how businesses will comply with all of these sanctions. I know that one of the sanctions relates to dealing with Russian banks and servicing Russian sovereign debt. And for the people who are owed money under that Russian sovereign debt, they'd like to get the money, but they don't want to violate the sanctions. And their lawyers are scratching their heads trying to figure out how they can do that. So there's a lot going on. There's a question under United States domestic law, the scope of the president's power. There are statutes that give the president a lot of power in security areas, but one thing the president doesn't have is the power to take away most favored nation treatment from foreign countries. So the House of Representatives in the United States has passed a statute saying we're going to do that. That's up to the Senate and then the president to sign that bill and approve it. So there's a lot going on. Other legal issues include, very importantly for businesses, the question of force majeure. Under what circumstances can I get out of my obligation to deliver goods to Russia or to deliver goods that rely on Russian inputs elsewhere when it's been blocked by sanctions or by the war itself? So lots of issues. And to answer your question, whether these sanctions will be effective, I think that the sanctions will have some incremental effect. Now, every kind of punishment has some effect on behavior. And the question is whether the effect it will have, the compelling effect it will have, will be sufficient compared to the benefits of non-compliance. And I think that's a question that, Putin's the decision maker for Russia, as far as I can tell. And that's a question that he has to make in terms of his survival and whatever else is important to him. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Professor Trackman, for again setting the table. We're looking at it from the non-military context and the non-military arsenal that has been deployed in this conflict. And as you said, Russia is the size of Spain in terms of its footprint of the global economy. And of course, every sanctioning government and every corporation that is looking at its actions on Russia is also thinking about one step ahead, which is what are the expectations from me if a similar conflict were to arise in the South China Sea, right? So, because China is not a small footprint country, China is the significant party over the horizon, and an example of Apple turning its back on Russia. It's one thing for Apple to just sort of turn away from Russia and give up, $3 million a day in terms of lost iPhone sales. Doesn't come close to the number of millions of dollars. I think it's like $330 million a day of lost iPhone sales if it were to be forced to turn its back on China, were China to advance overseas in a similar move. So now, speaking of a company that did have a massive impact on itself after having turned its back on Russia, is a company like BP. I think it gave up something close to a quarter of its market capitalization by stopping its projects with Gazprom and several other projects that are underway. So this turns us to the energy industry, for which Russia is not a small footprint country. It's an enormously important country. Professor Jaffe, what say you? Is this a change in the global order in terms of the energy industry? Do you think the energy players, the hydrocarbon players, are they, is this a point of no return for them? How are you seeing the forces playing out through the lens of the energy industry? And also a secondary question is, what's likely to happen to the whole transition plan from fossil fuels to green? And how is that being affected by this conflict?
Well, I think we're just, not those of us who are in energy, but everybody else who watches energy from a distance are starting to learn just how tethered the global market was to Russia across many different energy spaces, not just oil, which is most well known, and not just natural gas, which is getting a huge amount of attention even before the conflict, but even uranium for nuclear power. When you're in war, you need diesel fuel for all kinds of military vehicles. And it turns out the Europeans bought a lot of their diesel fuel from Russia. So a lot of things are interrupted. And of course, the impact's been very large. And there is this question, as others have discussed, when you talk about sanctions, who's it hurting? Is it worse for consumers in the West? Or is it worse for Russian businesses that have their living and the Russian government tied to energy revenue? But I want to set the table in a slightly different way. And that's because we've kind of been here before. And so we know that, we know what can happen. And I think that the changes that are going to come are going to be ginormous, and they're going to the business part of it is just going to be a small piece. So I'm sure a company like BP was under pressure from the UK government, and they probably made the right decision, but maybe had they not made the right decision, that decision would have been made for them. So better to get out ahead of it and do the right thing. But BP had a unique problem, and that is it had an actual substantial joint venture with Rosneft, which is not only the largest national oil company in Russia, but its chairman, Igor Sechin, is a very close associate of Vladimir Putin. Some people say that Igor Sechin would like to be president of Russia, so has political aspirations. And I think the oil industry has sort of unique experiences, not the least of which is that senior executives with companies like BP BP had this unique problem where their senior executives were on the board of directors of Rosneft. And so they had to step down. And if they were going to step down, then that company would have no control over what happens with its assets. And so therefore, the decision to step down and not be associated with the assets anymore, I think was an easier one, in the sense that once they were not going to be able to control the fate of their own infrastructure, I think they probably were uncomfortable continuing. And, but then you had sort of this cancel culture effect where Exxon, had in the end made the same decision about their assets in the Far East. And same thing, they took what steps they're going to have to take to wind it down. But I think they didn't want to be liable for what would happen with the operations of their own, again, giant assets, if they were not going to be the quote unquote operator. But all of these companies truly have had unbelievable experiences in Russia. It doesn't get written about a lot, but the recent, not the current chairman of BP, but the chairman before him, and he's only the current chairman of BP has only been in power in leading the company for about a year, maybe a little bit longer. The previous chairman had to be taken away and hidden in a safe house inside Russia and then smuggled out of the country because he was at risk to Vladimir Putin and the inner circle for his welfare. And Exxon executives had to go to safe houses. And indeed, the former chairman of Total, the one company that has not yet pulled out of Russia, was killed in the aftermath of having an argument with Vladimir Putin about the fate of certain investments that company was involved in way before we were in these sort of geopolitical conflicts. So the industry has a deep understanding of the dangers that came from the autographic nature of this particular government. And maybe that helped them, I think, maybe to see more forwardly than a company, say, like a McDonald's, that might have been less impacted by the brutality of this particular government. And then geopolitically, I mean, we're going to see changes, and that those changes interact with climate policy in a big way. But we're going to see an end, which has already been discussed, to this idea that somehow bridging Russia into this deep coupling of business and interaction in energy markets and trying to get Gazprom to comply with your EU rules for monopolies and having the energy charter and so forth, that all of these institutions that the Europeans have created and then tried to draw the Russians into to create a peaceful situation. That whole philosophy, which has a terminology in German, which I'm not good enough at foreign language to exercise here, maybe somebody in the audience knows the term, has been completely discredited now. And in Germany, there's really an about face. I think across the entire EU, there's an understanding that it was now unacceptable to have one's energy system be too tightly linked to Russia. Latvia and Lithuania have announced in the last 24 hours that they are going 100% away from Russian gas forever. And I think you're going to see more and more announcements like that. Germany has accelerated its move to try to get to 100% renewables by 2035 now, instead of into the 2040s. And I think you're going to see more and more interest in either shifting to other sources of natural gas or shifting to other commodities whatsoever, other energy commodities. And then there's going to be this question of, how permanent is it? So I argue that we're going to see a complete reordering of geopolitics. Often it starts with energy and then it works its way to other things. And the interesting outcome of the invasion of Crimea is one that's probably not too obvious to everyone. So I'll just throw that out. And then Bhaskar, I feel like I should stop talking a little bit because I know you wanted to have the students have time to have a discussion among themselves. So I just throw out this other provocative way of thinking about it. That's, I think, pretty interesting to think about. It's not a business thing. It's a more of a geopolitical thing. So in 2014, President Obama astutely lined up our allies, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, to have a full-on coordination for how to discourage Russia from going past Crimea, and in hopes to try to get even some influence with, even though Obama put on limited sanctions and it seems like that was not effective. Another thing was done at that time, you might recall in 2014, the energy market wasn't as tight because US production was very high. And so the countries that I mentioned started to develop large stockpiles. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates put between 70 million and 100 million barrels of extra oil on tankers and floated it off the coast of Fujairah, which is a port in southern United Arab Emirates. And Qatar produced a lot of extra natural gas and then sold it on a spot basis to Europe. And what was told to Vladimir Putin was that if Russia went past Crimea, that the Arabs would release all of that oil to the market and lower the price of oil dramatically. And that would, of course, greatly disadvantage Russia. And of course, the Qataris did dramatically lower the price of natural gas in Europe. And so there was this sort of giant energy coalition against Russia. In the subsequent years between 2014, 2015, and today, the Russians took advantage of some of America's concerns about human rights and the dispute between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, some sort of lingering personality and territorial disputes. And they exploited that to try to break up the coalition between the United States and those four energy superpowers. And that's kind of where we are today, where the United States has been unable to mobilize its allies again. And you have all of the Russian oligarchs literally taking their cryptocurrency and going to Dubai, which is in the United Arab Emirates, and settling there with no financial consequences to themselves, or less financial consequence to themselves. Those whose yachts were not grabbed fast enough have their yachts in Dubai. And that makes it hard for the United States to get full cooperation from the United Arab Emirates, because they've taken over to be crass, some of the money laundering from other places. Switzerland's in Europe, Switzerland's cooperating, but maybe Dubai is less cooperative. And then on the flip side, US-Saudi relations have been tense. Even under President Trump, they were tense during COVID and the problems that there were in the oil market for a while. The Saudis were dumping their oil, trying to dump their oil in the United States, and that was going to be a problem for our storage system, believe it or not. And so Trump and members of Congress threatened to actually stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia. And so we're kind of in this sort of, whose side are you on question here now with OPEC plus, which is OPEC plus Russia. And I think it's been very challenging for the Biden administration to come up with an oil solution for the global market, because Russia has prepared itself, as we talked about in banking, from 2014 to 2021. It prepared itself geopolitically on oil to make it a much more complicated transaction for the United States to mobilize all the other oil producers against it. So that's kind of the context of where we are. What I tell people is every time we have a giant oil price shock, we realize that there are inventions out there that allow us to do the same activity with less oil. That's going to happen again. That's good for climate change. So I understand that people are very concerned, because in the very short term, you've got some European countries turning back on a coal plant. But ultimately, this crisis could actually wind up being good for the climate over time, as more and more countries realize that they want to rely on renewable energy that they control inside their own borders. And I do think we're going to see that not only in Europe, but in other parts of the world.
So thank you, Professor Jaffe. It seems like there's a mixed message coming from all three of you. Professor Todd, it is a sort of a thundering conclusion you're taking us to. It seems like if the United States and its allies have to strike some kind of a pathway to an endgame, you have to give Vladimir Putin a way to save face, and no one really wants to do that, but there seems to be few options. Professor Trackman is saying, well, we've got sanctions in place, but they're not as effective as sending planes to enforce no-fly zone over Ukraine, for one, and of course other sort of military options which we should not consider. And from Professor Jaffe, a shock like this, kind of like the oil shocks of the past, does trigger changes of behaviors, does trigger transformational effects on industry and innovation. But in the near term, OPEC is not going to come along, and really the world has very few options to fundamentally change the current paradigm. And there may be a transition plan to alternatives to fossil fuels, but that's going to take some time. So in the near term, we're still kind of stuck with the dependence on Russia for hydrocarbons. And of course, Russia's...
Or we're not, and things are going to get uglier, and we're just going to have to stomach it. So I agree with Professor Trachtenberg that you want to have sanctions not hurt you worse than the other party. But sometimes there are things that are so important that we might come to the point where we're all going to actually, instead of just whining that the gasoline price is 50 cents higher, we all might need to drive less in the name of democracy. And you might see that we have to put full sanctions on Russian energy, which I think could still happen.
Yeah. Well, that might take us into another session, which we're not going to have time for. So what I'm going to suggest is, in the interest of time, we're going to go right to what I hope is a way to get all of you engaged on a different front as far as industry is concerned. So another major industry that is playing a role is, and Professor Tofted alluded to it earlier, which is the in parallel with the traditional war that's being waged, there's an information war. And in many ways, this information war is critical as you think about the pathways to some alternative endgames to this process. So one endgame, perhaps the most desirable one, is that there is an internal revolt from the streets, which of course is being squashed, and possibly from the elites. And the internal revolt kind of says enough is enough. We're all suffering, and we need to call an end to whatever this thing is. It's not allowed. They're not allowed to call it a war inside Russia. But a lot of that is dependent on what information is allowed within Russia, and that information is being very tightly controlled. So if you think about the information media, the major international media have been picked out of the country. So you don't have Facebook or TikTok or Twitter. The one major platform that's still there is Google. And Google, of course, has to operate under the rules of Russian censorship. For instance, they can't call this crisis a war, for example, and many others. So I guess the question that I would ask all of you to reflect on is, you have maybe 5 minutes. So this is going to be an intense situation. We're going to break up into little buzz groups around the room. So just look around, people just right around yourself, maybe groups of 3 or 4, and come up with a recommendation to the CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai, as to what should their posture on Russia be. So currently, the option is play by the rules of the Russian censors. Don't call this a war. Don't call this an invasion. Don't say anything bad, literally, about what's going on. If you don't, you're kicked out of the country. If you're kicked out of the country, you pretty much end any independent source of information inside the country. So you're really caught between a rock and a hard place. But Arik, you have an answer even before we get there.
Well, no, but I just might mention that one of the most important independent sources of news that's left in Russia is YouTube. When you look at Russian YouTube, there are hundreds of channels that are independent from Russian media. When we talk about Russian independent television channels or radio stations being banned, that's true. But there are still many Russians who watch YouTube. And so if Google goes, that's it. There's basically no independent media left in Russia.
And that's precisely why this is such an important issue to reflect on. So we're going to do this in 5 minutes. You're going to break out into small groups, and I'll give you 7 minutes. Okay, 7 minutes. So come up with a set of recommendations. Could be 3 points for Sundar Pichai as to what he should do vis-a-vis Russia. Okay.
Yes.
Talk to the censors or play along. And with Maria, can you help us do breakout groups?
Yes, absolutely. Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
7 minutes for everybody.
That is just, you only want to hear the positive things about it. Negative. It's good that you mentioned the lava central. I fully trust that a lot of people discover it, but the question is how long can the sanctions continue to happen? It sort of seems like we're 1 foot in, 1 foot out, and making promises that the sanctions will be lifted because we want to train. On the other hand, there's a kind of separate goal of squeezing Russia's border on that Russia doesn't get it. They're in the markets high tech, and so on. And the further this goes, the more Russia will be. There's already talk about the dollar kind of losing its currency status. It's not going to be so fast, but the longer this goes on, the more likely we'll be to withstand Well, that's part of the issue. I mean, I was talking to Dan, and he said, the longer the sanctions go on, the more the sanctions does look like against the rest. Although there are some interesting examples, some countries like Singapore that have joined parts of the sanctions. I thought was fascinating. I mean, it's not China. Well, that's right. That's right. And they want to be cautious. Secondary sanctions would be a big deal, but again, I mean, that's what's the cost of the global economy? I've heard estimates that the cost already is something at least $400 billion this year, if not upward of $1 trillion to the global economy. Yeah.
I also wonder for how long will these censor policies stay as they are. Will they get restricted? How will they change? In 6 months, will that impact? I guess I'm thinking at a certain point, Russia almost puts it
if only you were kind of as simple. I feel like as Monica said, it's very difficult to predict kind of regime change. It's likely that a conflict will be going through a state and it's already turned 50%. I think if the message to Putin is that sanctions will be in place. So
let's take 1 minute to wrap up. 1 minute to wrap up.
Continue doing it.
I think it's already on. So they changed it.
Yeah, but I mean, these incremental things like sanctioning luxury goods and whatnot. Even some of the sanctions on Russian goods is also relatively symbolic. With regard to energy,
Okay.
For Europe to wean itself off of Russian gas.
All right, we're ready to reassemble here. And our professors, your job is not done. Professor Trackman, Professor Toft, and Professor Jaffe, you still have to earn your snacks. So now you are the senior management team at Google, and you know what the stakes are, and we have some brilliant recommendations here from the room. So let me turn to this group right here. What say you? What should the Google management team, Sundar Pichai and the rest do as far as the situation is concerned?
We agreed that they should.
Please speak up, please.
Yeah. I think we agreed that they should continue to stay and operate in the Russian market, and that inevitably means that in order to do so, if they make that decision, that they have to comply by the sanctions laws within Russia. So that's not really a decision matrix there. That's just something they have to do. They decide to stay. So the question really becomes, how do they respond to the reputational damage that creates in the international community and in the United States? Which I think we're still debating. We don't have a clear answer, but it would be a matter of quantifying that cost. And also, I guess, the reasonable argument to draw there with perhaps US authorities is that there's a strategic advantage in having a Western company's presence there and not leaving an information that could be scooped by domestic counterparts or Chinese ones that are already taking root.
So it's a price worth paying, you're saying. Would you go to work for them?
For Google?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, all right. The Google team.
let me raise one issue that I think we need to inject here because it happened to another company that is a data company. So the law in Russia is very strict. If you even say it's a war or say that Russia made an invasion, then your people can be arrested. So I was doing a podcast for a company that's a giant media company, and they still hadn't excavated all their employees from Moscow yet. And so we all had to be like doubly, triply careful not to say there was a war in Ukraine, because that could mean that their employees in Moscow could be arrested. So I just want to inject that out there, because if anybody, is Google going to keep personnel on the ground? Because if you do, and somebody Googles something on Google and it uses the word war, your employees could be arrested. So I just want to inject that out there as maybe a slightly bigger business problem than, are you going to do it only working remotely or not? Or are you going to have, do you need to have personnel on the ground?
Thank you for that, Professor Jaffe.
To qualify, the vast majority of Google's employees in Russia are Russians. In fact, they have their own branch there. So, yes, that's a fair point. But the only alternative is these Russians who are working for Google are out of their jobs.
Great. Okay. Do we have a different recommendation from one of the other teams related to what you heard? A different path. Go ahead, Fran.
Yeah, I was just as a lesson for the mimicking the lessons to counter-strike China, like this. We don't have any of these independent media in China, and we put out, you will see how the two political regimes will really counter by economy fight or property fight or other leverage they have. Yeah, that's my experience.
So leave, and then let Russia and China embrace each other in a parallel universe. That part of the Professor Tom.
Yeah, can I just ask, and I apologize, I have to go at 4:15 because I have another meeting, but I guess the question is for the first group, thank you for providing that perspective, is to what end, right? So so you have to answer that second order question, and then the third order question is what, by staying, what are they hoping to achieve? And by leaving, what do they achieve, right? And so I'd just be curious to see what the group thinks, because it sounds as if it's part of this, well, if they stay, then at least some information can get in there. But if it's censored information, then it's not getting out. So it's sort of this decision tree all the way down. And I'm not saying I have the answer, but it just seems to me that we need to sort of track down all the way the decision tree to see what is our ultimate end game. Is it to punish the regime? Is it to empower the people? Is it to save employees, right? And there's different things that we're trying to accomplish.
And I wonder if that would dovetail with what the group said, which was trying to do something to ameliorate public opinion. And so you might explain that cost-benefit analysis in an altruistic way. This isn't for Google's business. We'll contribute our Russian profits to Ukrainian reconstruction. And here's our calculation. If we stay, we allow information in that will be useful to the Russian public. If we go, then we don't do any good. So that might be part of the PR camp.
Can I just say one quick thing about saving employees? Because while it's been announced by many of these companies, hundreds of companies, that they're leaving Russia. In fact, the vast majority of them have only suspended their operations for the time being, and they continue to pay their employees. In fact, they've been furloughed, some of them, and some of them are actually continuing to work for the company in one way or another. Some have only curtailed their business and haven't pulled out completely. So I think there's an expectation on the part of many businesses that they will eventually be able to come back to the Russian market. So I think that's an interesting dynamic that many companies are sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out at the moment, and only time will tell whether this is a permanent situation or whether the Russian market will open back up.
Yeah, and some professional service firms, like some of the law firms, have actually created an independent entity. And the independent entity is a Russian entity, is continuing to do business.
That's right.
And-
And there are some companies that have found it extremely difficult to get out. For example, Professor Jaffe's field, oil field services, like Halliburton, while they have made their intention clear that they're going to get out of Russia, that's much easier said than done.
Right. And also like BP's exit, there's a cost to going back in. Now, abandoning Russia altogether and putting Russia into the China space. I don't know. Did you have a follow-up point, Brian?
Yes, like as the anchoring versus a comment, like if the Google state trying to keep the information like independent freedom, to what extent would you alter Russian population's opinion? But based on the poll that I just heard from lower 70 to just like lower 80s, I don't think the staying is gonna have much impact on the opinion of the public, and also how much impact of the population have on Putin's decision making. That's another question.
Okay. I know Professor Toft, you have to go, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm sure there are questions from your observations, so people can reach out to you directly, monica.toft@tufts.edu. Any comments from the screen? I know that we tried to put you in breakout groups in online. Were there any observations from your discussion that you'd like to share that haven't been surfaced already? Feel free to put up your hand or say something.
There was a comment from Tatiana. Tatiana, would you like to unmute yourself?
I've unmuted myself. Hello, everybody. I have a friend who, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I have a friend who just asked me this morning to look over a message that he and a group of other friends have for people they are phoning in Russia. And I didn't like the message because it went immediately, would go through their sensors and they would not, they wouldn't get through. I told them to use examples from Russian history in order to speak to the people there. I said, start by saying something like, I really appreciate Russian culture. Great writers like Pushkin, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and great musicians like Shostakovich, because he was during a war. And then say, one of the interesting things is that leaders, when there are any, first of all, it would be great for leaders to see the suffering of people with any type of an incursion, with not an incursion, with any type of what is being done, whatever you call it, but not call it a war, right? Whatever is being done, and see the suffering of people, the suffering of children, and the suffering of mothers, and the suffering of those who have lost people they love. And that great leaders in Russia, for instance, using Peter the Great, was not afraid to become a simple person to go and learn. And go to a country like Holland, where he went to learn and masqueraded as if he were not the Tsar. This is the type of thing you can use and say, it is not by staying away from everything that one learns what is happening and one can help people. I think that is the best way to deal with the bubble that we find Putin has put himself in the Kremlin. For instance, there was a different thing. I've even used Stalin in my example. Stalin during World War II stayed in the Kremlin, but the whole government of the Soviet Union had moved away. He stayed there even though the Germans were advancing. This was to show his solidarity with the people suffering. And Putin has not shown the people, even his own people, suffering. And that is what is implied in the type of leadership. When you had great leadership with Peter the Great, you even had Catherine the Great go out into closer to the battlefield to see what was happening. And he's not doing that. He's staying in the Kremlin. It is by using examples from Russian history with itself that one can get in an indirect way to the people in Russia to have them try to have them change their ideas about what is happening in the Ukraine.
Great. Well, thank you, Tatiana, for your observations and comments. Really very, very helpful. I know we're not only bumping up against time, we're bumping beyond time. Any closing observations from Professor Trachtman, Professor Jaffe to kind of round this out before we head out and continue to scratch our heads about this issue?
One thing I think would be worth thinking about is the increasing recognition by businesses of transnational risk. And there was a time, maybe pre-COVID, when you could do international business and not engage in too much political risk, especially in the North. But today, I think businesses are recognizing that they have to do an analysis, and there are great risks to diversifying their supply chains. And so the calculus of businesses will differ, and the Fletcher study of political risk and how it relates to business will grow more important, I think, because of this.
Yeah, and the supply chain issues have just been compounded because there was an event prior to the Russian-Ukraine crisis called the pandemic, which already reminded us that the over-concentration of supply chains in certain parts of the world was a risk that should be revisited. Professor Jaffe, any closing thoughts?
No, I mean, I just think in that context, it did really, even in energy, it really did start with COVID. And companies started to realize that their supply chains, especially for clean energy, were too concentrated. And you've got new initiatives in places like Europe, even here in the United States, to try to move manufacturing on, reshore manufacturing in some critical areas. And I think we're just going to see more of that now. And I like what Professor Trachtman said. We tend to think about globalization as a way of making business efficient and, using the most efficient location for labor and the most efficient places for material. And I think we're probably going to move away from that. And there's going to be more emphasis on duplication of effort that had been kind of eliminated from the global system. I think we'll probably move back to redundant national infrastructure.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And in order to kind of get us off what lies beyond this session on a somewhat of an uncomfortable note, let me actually disagree with some of this, which is I do believe that there is going to be a significant rethinking in terms of how we organize supply chains, how we think about global operations across all kinds of businesses and other organizations. However, organizational memories are short, and the market invariably creeps back. And some of these crises do have, they leave scar tissue. But then the competitive pressures come in, and the competitive pressures then kind of sort of make some of these efficiency considerations, redundancy considerations sort of creep back into people's calculus. And back we go. The wheel starts all over again. So I suspect this is a streaming show with many seasons. So we haven't seen the last episode and the finale as yet. But thank you to our intradisciplinary experts for helping us unpack what is clearly a complex issue, for setting the table for what was not enough time for our interdisciplinary experts to think about recommendations to Google and possibly other companies that are sort of on the dilemma. This is indeed a dilemma which requires people like yourself to step into roles of leadership and decision-making and perhaps help us think about these issues in a somewhat different way. Because a lot of this, as Professor Toft kind of said, reminded us, is an outcome of a very old 20th century way of framing the world. And that really hasn't changed. So we need to step into the 21st century, for which we look to all of you. So thank you to everybody. Jaffe, and to all of you on the screen. And We are grateful that you were patient enough with the hybrid modality. This isn't always the easiest way of having a conversation, but I'm glad that you mentioned it. Thank you to our organizers here, Nate and Dorothy, for carrying the heavy burden of getting us together, and Maria back in the office. Thank you, Joel.